Sumeru's release was peak Genshin moment. Everyone was excited for a new region, new music, new stories, new element, new reactions, and new characters. FOntaine did a good job revitalizing that moment, and I hope Natlan does the same. But unlike FOntaine, that had pretty much a smooth release, Sumeru had some issues. The characters came with a controversy. Sumeru is based on South Asia and some Middle Eastern influences, unlike previous regions that seem to have a distinct country they're based on, Mondstadt Germany, Liyue China, Inazuma Japan. Sumeru was a melting pot, which was probably their first mistake. Now, there isn't anything wrong with a melting pot region if done well, but Hoyoverse's issue was that despite taking references from cultures where the people were a mixture of light and dark skin tones, the characters were primarily light-skinned, and even the ones that were supposed to be dark fell on the lighter side of a dark skin tone. The only ones with actual dark skins were the enemies that we had to fight to farm for materials. That left a sour taste in people's mouths, so despite all the good that came with Sumeru, Hoyoverse was quickly labeled as a racist company. Now, they aren't necessarily racist, more like colorist, and yes, there is a difference. Racism lies in the hatred or dislike of certain races other than your own. Holding prejudice to people due to their race is what racism is, hence why it is called racism. Now, colorism, on the other hand, is the dislike of anyone that has a certain skin color or skin tone. Where they come from doesn't really matter. The color of their skin is what matters. Colorism is very prevalent in Asian countries, with skin whitening creams being advertised everywhere and children being told at a very young age that even if they're a little bit dark, even if that darkness comes from the sun, then they're ugly or dirty, and usually they come from the same country as the person telling them this, usually a relative. Hoyoverse is mostly colorist, not really racist. If they were racist, Sumeru as a region would either be much worse or just wouldn't exist at all. Both racism and colorism are obviously bad, but I need people to know the difference before throwing out accusations. Some people try to defend Hoyoverse by saying, oh, they didn't know any better, which is just not true. With the amount of effort they put into each character's design, most of which are filled with cultural references, the effort of Sumeru's architecture, the music, and everything else, you'd think they realize that the cultures they're taking from has an array of skin tones. If a white company did something like this, no one would be trying to excuse them by saying, oh, they didn't know any better. Just like how you wouldn't tolerate racism from white companies, you shouldn't tolerate colorism from Asian companies either. If there is one thing Hoyoverse doesn't skimp on, it's the amount of research that goes into each of their regions and characters. That is why Genshin is so well made, so I cannot believe they didn't see all the different shades of skin tones of the people from the cultures they were inspired by while doing this extensive research. Obviously, not every single character from Sumeru's cast was bad. Nilu, Kaveh, and Dignari seem to represent the cultures they are from significantly well. Dignari and Alhaitham are also pretty similar to their real-life namesakes when it comes to what they do in-game. Dori is pretty much the only one that is just hated for her design and personality due to it being very stereotypical and orientalist. Orientalism is when certain cultures are represented not in their actuality, but by the lens of, usually, racist Westerners. Think Aladdin. Her design is not only culturally incorrect, her personality trait being greedy is a very stereotypical personality trait given to characters that are supposed to be Arab or Turkish, I think in her case. Candice and Dia also face scrutiny, though at a lesser extent than Dori, for not being dark enough. Candice was based on an African queen that went by the name Kandake, also known as Queen Mother. Learning more about Kandake, you can see the similarities and where the inspirations for Candice come from. Candice and Dia are both not dark enough for the culture they're supposedly from. Nahida was also scrutinized for her design and size during her initial release, but unlike Dori, these characters were well written enough that people can look past their design mishaps and still appreciate them for what they are while wishing their designs were just a little bit better. Sumeru wasn't all bad. It was mostly good, I would say, but it is good to acknowledge these things so the same things don't happen again, or so at least people can be more informed on these types of issues. Natlan, from what I've gathered from all the Google searches, it was one search, and watching some lore videos, seems to be inspired by Native America pre-colonization, like the Aztecs and Mayans, and a little bit of West Africa. Kind of like how Sumeru is mostly South Asian with a dash of Middle Eastern, Natlan is rumored to be mostly Native American with a dash of West Africa. I know a lot of people hate the fact that Sumeru was a melting pot, but as someone who grew up in a country that is a melting pot, I quite enjoy it. I enjoy when places have multiple cultural inspirations. It makes it so much more colorful to learn about. So for me, Sumeru being a melting pot wasn't really a bad thing, but I can understand why some people would be upset about it. Having a culture mixed with another one instead of getting its own dedicated region can be disheartening. But I still believe when done well, melting pot regions can be good. If Natlan really does have West Africa influences, then that would be very innovative, because despite how interesting African culture is, it is never really used in fantasy. I'm hoping Hoyoverse uses this opportunity to shine some light, some positive light, on African culture. I have full faith that the environment, the architecture, the music will all be spot on, but what worries me is the characters themselves. This is our last chance to get an Archon that is dark skin. Sumeru was technically their first chance, but I wasn't expecting Nahida to have dark skin. I wasn't really expecting anything, to be honest, nor was I necessarily disappointed in her having light skin. I didn't really care. So for me, Natlan would be their first and last chance to give an Archon darker skin than what we currently have. Shejnaya is based on Russia, for God's sakes, so no way in hell is the Cerisa getting dark skin. I don't think she's even getting tan skin. I'm expecting her to be very pale, maybe like Rosaria, but better. Anyways, I'm hoping that Natlan's Archon has dark skin, or if they do the same thing they did with FOntaine, where the Archon is no longer the Archon and they get replaced by someone else, whoever they may be, I hope they have dark skin. I want a Natlan version of Nervalet so bad that is a sword user. We only have one Pyro sword user, and it's Bennett, and I love Bennett. We need another one. We, as a community, should also not be quick to jump to conclusions. While Hoyoverse deserves the backlash they got from Sumeru's release, certain things were blown out of proportion, and all of Sumeru was labeled as Orientalist by people who don't even know anything about the culture that Sumeru was supposed to be representing. Characters like Lilu were labeled as Orientalist because of her outfit, when in actuality her outfit was based on Persian dancers before Persia, now known as Iran's Islamization. Technology's design was called messy, random, and ugly, when in actuality all the little parts of his design have cultural references to tie in the design. So before you get your pitchforks, maybe wait for the people who are actually knowledgeable about the cultural references of the characters to speak up before erasing all the hard work that went into the region by calling it racist, or whatever it is people are going to start screaming when Natlan comes out. I hope it isn't as bad as Sumeru, but I won't hold my breath. There's always going to be people who are mad about something, but as long as Hoyoverse themselves represent the cultures correctly, we as a community should just ignore these people. The Genshin community does have a habit of ignoring actual cultural references in most characters. They claim they want more cultural representation, but there's so many characters in Genshin that have so much cultural representation that people just look past because they don't look how they expect cultural representation to look like. They think cultural representation is like a character with dark skin. Like dark skin is their version of diversity. When in actuality, there's so many more ways to show diversity without the characters being dark skinned. Nothing wrong with a dark skinned character, but if your perception of diversity is just colorful cast skin wise, you need to get your facts straight. There's so many cultures in this world where they're not dark skinned people. There are a lot of cultures where they're not light skinned. And yes, someone's going to try to skew this into me saying, oh, whoever shouldn't have dark skin. And while I can acknowledge that skin tone isn't the only way to show diversity, unlike South Asia and the Middle East, where light-skinned people are fairly common, Native America and West Africa fall on the darker side of skin tones. There is no way to defend Hoyoverse if they decide to make every character in Natlan white, because unlike South Asia and the Middle East, where light-skinned people are, like I said, fairly common, in Native America and West Africa, they tend to fall on the darker side, more tan and darker skin tones. The ratio of light and dark skin in Native America and West Africa is more disproportionate and skewed towards tan or darker skin than the ratio when it comes to South Asia and the Middle East. So hopefully they design their characters appropriately. I'm very excited for Natlan, and I know I won't be disappointed by the region itself, but I hope the characters aren't just different shades of eggshell white. As long as we have good representation and the characters are well made, Natlan's release should be just as hyped as Sumeru and FOntaine. A new region release is always a fun time in the community. Hopefully isn't filled with controversy this time. If all goes to plan, Natlan should come out during August, so about 4 more months, which is wild because it feels like just yesterday when FOntaine came out. In conclusion, as long as Hoyoverse learns from their mistakes from Sumeru, which was mostly just them not giving characters appropriate skin tones, and some mildly questionable quest dialogue in some of the desert quests, all should be well. If they somehow manage to make the Archon white, I hope they have a very good explanation for it. I genuinely cannot wait for the Archon quest. FOntaine was such a well-made one. Sumeru was also really good. They've been doing really well with the Archon quests, and I'm hoping that momentum just gets better as we go on. Anywho, what are you most excited for about in Natlan? For me, it's the dragons Nervalet mentioned, and hopefully the region itself is bigger than FOntaine. I loved FOntaine's diving mechanic, but it felt so small, which I guess makes sense. It's based on France and Britain, which aren't necessarily really big countries to begin with. I just can't wait to have a new place to explore, and maybe we get a new method of exploration, since we're not getting a new element for sure. New systems are typically introduced in new regions, with Sumeru being a new element and FOntaine being diving. Anyways, tell me what you're most excited for in Natlan. That's all I have for today. Subscribe and see you whenever.